The quiet neighborhood. The sun dipped low in the sky, casting long shadows over the quiet suburban streets of Maple Grove. The trees, with leaves ablaze in brilliant hues of red, orange, and gold, whispered in the breeze. It was a picturesque evening, the kind that made Margaret Evans feel a sense of pride in her small, tight-knit community. It was a neighborhood of well-kept lawns, tasteful homes, and most importantly, familiar faces. Margaret, a woman in her late 40s, stood behind a large bay window in her living room, her pale face glowing in the fading light. She sipped her tea as her eyes wandered lazily over the street. Life here was predictable, comfortable, and to Margaret, that was just the way it should be. Her husband, Peter, was away on business, and her daughter, Emma, was upstairs studying. Margaret had the house to herself, with nothing but the rhythmic ticking of the antique clock on the wall to keep her company. She liked it this way, peaceful and orderly. But something about the evening felt off, a nagging feeling tugging at the edges of her mind. She couldn't quite put her finger on it until she noticed a figure walking down the street. At first glance, it seemed like any other passerby, someone taking a leisurely evening stroll. But Margaret's sharp eyes, always keen to pick up on anything out of the ordinary, lingered on the man. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and wore a dark hoodie pulled over his head, hands stuffed into his pockets. His stride was unhurried, almost casual, but there was something about him that made Margaret's heart rate quicken. She didn't recognize him, and in this neighborhood, she prided herself on knowing everyone. Maple Grove wasn't the kind of place where strangers wandered aimlessly. It was a well-off neighborhood, and to Margaret, every face told a story, except for this one. She set her cup down on the windowsill, her brow furrowing. He was just walking, she reasoned. Maybe he was new to the area, a visitor. But the more she watched, the more uneasy she became. He didn't look at ease, not the way someone familiar with the neighborhood would. His head turned slightly as he glanced at the houses, his pace slowing near the larger homes as though he were assessing them. Margaret's fingers hovered over her phone. A million scenarios raced through her mind, each one more troubling than the last. She had heard the stories of strangers coming into neighborhoods like this one, casing houses for burglary, sometimes worse. She thought of the community group chat, the way neighbors exchanged quiet warnings whenever something seemed amiss. Her heartbeat thudded in her ears, and without thinking too long, she pulled up the chat. Sure enough, a recent message had already popped up. Anyone noticed the guy in the hoodie walking around? The message came from Claire, who lived 2 houses down. Margaret's anxiety spiked. It wasn't just her. Others had seen him too. Margaret's mind raced. Should she say something? Should she call someone? She glanced at the figure again. He had stopped now, standing at the corner of the street, looking around as though contemplating his next move. The tension in her chest tightened. Something wasn't right. She had lived here long enough to trust her instincts, and they were screaming at her now. Her fingers moved almost instinctively, dialing 911. She hesitated for a brief moment, second-guessing herself. Was she overreacting? Was she jumping to conclusions? But then she remembered the stories, the unsettling news reports of home invasions and worse. Better safe than sorry, she thought. 911. What's your emergency? The calm, professional voice on the other end made Margaret feel a little foolish for a moment. But then she spoke, her voice low and firm. There's a man walking around my neighborhood, she began, trying to keep the anxiety out of her tone. He looks out of place, suspicious. I think he's casing the houses. He's wearing a hoodie, and I think he's hiding something in his pockets. The operator's voice remained calm as she asked for more details, assuring Margaret that a patrol car would be sent to check it out. As she hung up, Margaret felt a strange mixture of relief and unease. She had done her part, she told herself. She had protected her neighborhood. Still, doubt nagged at her. Was she doing the right thing, or was she making assumptions? She shook the thought away. She had to trust her gut, and her gut told her that something wasn't right. Meanwhile, outside, Desmond Harris continued his walk, unaware of the scrutiny he was under. To him, it was just another evening, a chance to unwind after a long day. He had recently moved to Maple Grove, finally able to afford a home in a place like this after years of hard work. The quiet, tree-lined streets and well-manicured lawns were everything he had hoped for. It was a symbol of success, a place he could be proud to call home. But as he walked, a familiar weight settled on his shoulders. The weight of being watched, of being judged. Desmond had grown accustomed to the subtle stares, the way people's eyes would linger on him just a little too long. It was an unspoken language he had learned to read over the years, a language that said, "You don't belong here." He had felt it in grocery stores, in restaurants, and now, even in his own neighborhood. Desmond paused for a moment, admiring a large oak tree at the corner. It reminded him of the trees back home, the ones his grandfather used to sit under while telling stories. Lost in thought, he didn't notice the faint sound of a patrol car approaching. It wasn't until the blue and red lights reflected off the windows of a nearby house that he realized something was wrong. The patrol car slowed to a stop just a few feet away from him, its lights flashing but the sirens off. 2 officers, one male and one female, stepped out, their eyes scanning him cautiously. "Sir," the male officer called out, his hand resting lightly on his belt. "We'd like to speak with you for a moment." Desmond's heart sank. He had been here before. The calm stroll through his new neighborhood had now turned into something else entirely. Keeping his hands visible, he raised them slightly, his voice steady. "Is there a problem, officer?" The female officer, who had stayed a step behind, glanced at her partner before responding. "We received a call about someone matching your description, walking through the area. We're just doing a routine check." Desmond swallowed the frustration rising in his chest. It wasn't the first time he had been stopped for matching a description. It probably wouldn't be the last. He had lived this moment too many times to count, but it didn't make it any easier. "Yes, I live here," he said calmly, meeting the officer's gaze. The male officer's eyes narrowed slightly, still assessing him. "Can we see some ID?" Without hesitation, Desmond reached slowly into his pocket and pulled out his wallet. He handed over his driver's license, watching as the officer inspected it closely. After a moment, the tension in the air began to dissipate, but not completely. The officers exchanged glances, their posture relaxing slightly, though there was still an undercurrent of suspicion. "Thank you for your cooperation, sir," the female officer said, handing back his ID. "Sorry for the inconvenience." Desmond nodded, his face calm, though inside he felt the sting of the encounter. As the officers returned to their car and slowly drove away, he stood there for a moment, letting the weight of the situation sink in. He had done nothing wrong, yet here he was, once again, forced to prove his right to simply exist. But before he could take another step, the sharp sound of a door flying open cut through the air. The echoes of assumptions. As Desmond's hands pressed rhythmically on Margaret's chest, the scenes surrounding them seemed to blur, leaving only the sound of his breathing and the desperate, faint gasps escaping from the woman's fragile body. The officers, who only minutes earlier had stood in silent judgment of him, now hovered nearby, their hands twitching at their sides, unsure of what to do. The faint sound of a distant siren grew louder, but Desmond knew the ambulance was still too far away for comfort. Margaret's life was hanging by a thread, and Desmond's mind raced through the procedural steps of CPR. He could feel her heart beneath his hands, faltering but not yet completely gone. Every second counted, and he refused to allow the weight of her earlier accusations to slow him down. The color was draining from her face, her lips turning pale, and the realization that her life might slip away hit him hard. But he couldn't let that happen, not under his watch. Come on," he muttered under his breath, his tone commanding, but meant only for himself. He had to stay focused. For Desmond, this wasn't just about saving a life. It was about proving, if only to himself, that he could rise above everything this moment represented. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on him. Here he was, a black man, accused by a white woman of not belonging, now fighting to save her life. The tension in the air was thick, the stench of assumptions lingering like an unwelcome fog. The officers seemed frozen, watching from a distance, as if they were still processing the turn of events. Desmond's world had always been colored by such moments, split-second judgments, silent questions, and the nagging suspicion that no matter how successful or educated he became, some people would always see him as an outsider. But right now, none of that mattered. He was in control. He had the knowledge and the power to keep Margaret alive. And that was all that filled his mind. The female officer, hands trembling, brought her radio back to her lips. "Dispatch, we need that ambulance immediately," she called, her voice edged with panic. Desmond didn't need her panic. He needed her to stay calm. He continued chest compressions, the sound of his hands pressing into Margaret's chest, a constant reminder of the fragility of life. Every second she remained unconscious, her chances diminished. But he couldn't think about that now. Not yet. "Check her breathing," Desmond barked, snapping the female officer out of her trance. She hesitated for a moment, unsure whether to follow the command, but something in Desmond's tone pushed her into action. She knelt beside him, leaning close to Margaret's mouth and nose, feeling for any signs of breath. "Still shallow," she reported, her voice softer now, filled with uncertainty. "But it's there." Desmond nodded, not breaking his rhythm. He didn't need the officer's validation. He knew Margaret's condition better than anyone else at that moment. Margaret Evans, the woman who prided herself on knowing everyone in the neighborhood, had never once questioned her own assumptions. Until now, deep in the recesses of her fading consciousness, she could feel her body betraying her heartbeat irregular, her lungs fighting for air. She was drowning in a sea of panic, her mind spiraling out of control. But amidst that chaos, something else floated to the surface. A question she had never asked herself. What if I was wrong? Margaret had always believed in the image she projected, the concerned, responsible neighbor, the woman who made sure her community stayed safe and intact. She organized block parties, kept an eye on the children, and made sure to report any suspicious activity. It was all in the name of safety, she told herself. But now, as her life flickered in and out, the weight of her own assumptions pressed down on her chest like a vice. She had judged Desmond before even seeing him as a person. To her, he had been a threat, a stranger, an unknown element in her perfectly ordered world. But was he? The darkness in her mind gave way to brief flashes of memory. Desmond's calm face as he spoke to the officers, his measured tone, his steady hand offering his ID. Margaret had dismissed all of that. She had assumed the worst. Why? The question echoed through her fading consciousness, a gnawing doubt that felt more painful than the physical struggle she was enduring. Was this what she had become? A woman so blinded by fear and prejudice that she couldn't see beyond a hoodie and a skin tone. Desmond's concentration was razor sharp, but the weight of everything that had happened began to creep into his thoughts. The way Margaret had marched toward him earlier, her voice cutting through the air with absolute certainty. "He doesn't live here. I know everyone in this neighborhood." She had declared him guilty with such conviction that even the officers had second-guessed themselves. It wasn't the first time Desmond had experienced something like this, and it wouldn't be the last. His life, despite all the accolades, the degrees, and the success, was still filled with moments like this. Moments where his very existence was questioned. But this time, it stung a little deeper. Maybe because he had just moved into the neighborhood. Maybe because he had worked so hard to prove, to himself and others, that he belonged in places like this. Yet here he was, still a suspect in his own life story. But all of that had to be pushed aside for now. Margaret needed him. That much was clear. Suddenly, the rhythmic sound of his compressions was interrupted by a slight twitch in Margaret's body. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but Desmond noticed it. He pressed on, his focus unbroken. Another twitch, then a small gasp. Her chest began to rise and fall more consistently now, the breaths shallow but steadying. Desmond exhaled a long, slow breath, not of relief, but of cautious optimism. "She's stabilizing," he said, his voice calmer now, more measured. The officers, still standing nearby, exchanged glances, a mix of awe and guilt crossing their faces. The female officer stepped forward, her face pale, eyes wide. Is she going to make it?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Desmond didn't answer right away. He continued monitoring Margaret's breathing, noting the color slowly returning to her lips. The ambulance would be here any minute now, and Margaret would be in better hands. He had done everything he could. But what weighed on him now wasn't just Margaret's condition. It was the unspoken shift in the dynamic between him and the officers. The male officer cleared his throat awkwardly, stepping closer. "Dr. Harris, right?" His tone was different now, softer, unsure of itself. "Thank you. We didn't realize." Desmond glanced at him briefly, his expression unreadable. "You didn't ask," he said simply. The officer's face flushed with a mix of embarrassment and shame. He had no response to that. What could he say? They hadn't asked. They had assumed. And their assumptions could have cost Margaret her life. The ambulance's siren wailed closer, breaking the silence that had fallen over the scene. Desmond stood, wiping the sweat from his brow, his hands still trembling slightly from the exertion and adrenaline. The female officer's eyes followed him, a mixture of guilt and gratitude written across her face. "I'm sorry," she muttered, almost too softly for him to hear. "We should have." Desmond met her gaze, but he didn't say anything. There was nothing left to say. The weight of the moment had already spoken volumes. As the paramedics arrived and rushed to take over, Desmond stepped back, letting them do their job. Margaret's life was no longer in his hands, but her fate still hung in the balance. He watched as they loaded her onto a stretcher, her body now stabilized but fragile. He turned to walk away, but something held him back, a thought, a flicker of emotion that he couldn't quite place. The officers watched him go, their faces reflecting the weight of their earlier misjudgment. They had doubted him, just as Margaret had, but he had saved her life anyway. That's what made Desmond different from them. He didn't need their approval. He didn't need to prove his worth. He knew who he was, and that was enough. As the ambulance doors closed and the siren faded into the distance, Desmond walked slowly back toward his home, his steps heavy but steady. The neighborhood, once a symbol of achievement, now felt more complicated. He had saved a life today, but the cost of that life-saving effort wasn't lost on him. Margaret would live, but would she, or anyone else in this place, ever truly see him? The echoes of their assumptions still lingered in the air, louder than the sirens ever had been. The weight of the invisible. Desmond stood in his living room, staring at the boxes still waiting to be unpacked. His new home, an achievement meant to symbolize the culmination of years of hard work and perseverance, now felt hollow. The walls seemed to close in around him, suffocating in their silence. He'd saved a life today, yet instead of feeling a sense of pride or accomplishment, Desmond felt the weight of something else, something heavier, more insidious. The paramedics had taken Margaret away, and the police officers had left without another word. He had returned home, but it was a victory without celebration. The hoodie that had marked him as suspicious earlier was now tossed onto the couch, forgotten. He had worn it without a second thought this morning, choosing it for comfort as he unpacked his life into this new space. But now it felt like a symbol, an unintentional uniform that had been assigned a meaning far beyond the fabric. The weight of assumptions. It was the kind of weight Desmond knew all too well. He had spent his entire life pushing against it, trying to outrun it, outshine it, outachieve it. But no matter how fast he ran or how high he climbed, it seemed to follow him, lurking in the background, waiting for moments like today to remind him that it was still there. He walked over to the window, peering out at the quiet, pristine streets of the neighborhood he had worked so hard to call home. The sun was setting, casting long shadows over the manicured lawns and trimmed hedges. Desmond had chosen this place for its serenity, for the promise of safety and stability that it represented. But now, that promise felt like an illusion. His phone buzzed on the kitchen counter, and for a moment, Desmond considered ignoring it. But something urged him to pick it up. He glanced at the screen. Unknown number. A part of him wanted to let it go to voicemail, but another part, the part of him that couldn't help but hope for some resolution to the day's events, compelled him to answer. Hello. His voice was steady, though his heart wasn't. Dr. Harris. The voice on the other end was familiar, one of the police officers from earlier, though he couldn't quite place which one. Yes, this is Dr. Harris, Desmond replied, his tone polite but guarded. He wasn't in the mood for more apologies or explanations. I just wanted to. Thank you again. For what you did today. For Mrs. Evans, the officer said, stumbling over his words. The paramedic said she's stable. She's going to be okay. Desmond closed his eyes, exhaling slowly. I'm glad to hear that, he said, though his voice was more tired than anything else. That's what matters. There was a pause on the other end of the line, as if the officer was wrestling with what to say next. Desmond could almost hear the internal battle, the push and pull between duty and guilt. Listen, we misjudged you, the officer finally said, his voice quieter now, more measured. We made assumptions, and that's on us. I just wanted to say I'm sorry. Desmond stopped under a streetlight, casting a long shadow behind him. His hands found the pockets of his jacket, and he stood there, staring at the cracked pavement beneath his feet. The cold of the night seeped into him, but his mind was too busy processing everything to notice. He felt raw, open, vulnerable in a way that made him uncomfortable, yet it was a vulnerability that demanded attention. Margaret had apologized. Sincerely, that much he could tell. She had looked him in the eyes, her voice quivering with shame, regret, and the painful realization of her own ignorance. But what did that apology really mean in the grand scheme of things? Would it change anything? Would she be different tomorrow? A week from now? A year from now? Or would the world around them continue to hum along in the same broken rhythm it always had? He let out a sigh, his breath visible in the cold air. Hours later, Desmond found himself back home, standing in the doorway of his apartment. He stared at the familiar surroundings, his living room, the bookshelf filled with medical texts and novels, the photos of his family on the mantel. It was a comforting space, a place he had worked hard to create, to call his own. But tonight, it felt different. Home, once a refuge, now felt like just another room. Desmond wandered into the kitchen, grabbing a glass of water and leaning against the counter. His mind replayed the evening over and over, dissecting every word, every look, every pause. There was no escaping it. He would have to confront this feeling. Ignoring it, suppressing it as he had done so many times before, wasn't going to work this time. This time, it was personal. He had never truly allowed himself to be vulnerable in the way he had with Margaret earlier that night. His words had been raw, unfiltered. In a way, it felt freeing to finally say what had been building up inside him for so long. But now that the words had been spoken, they left behind an emptiness, a void he didn't quite know how to fill. The following morning arrived with muted light filtering through the blinds. Desmond hadn't slept. His body was tired, but his mind refused to rest. The events of the night before, Margaret's apology, and the walk through the quiet streets replayed in his head like a record stuck on repeat. He wasn't sure what the next steps were. How could he move forward when he felt like he was still standing in the same spot, trapped by the weight of it all? Desmond decided he needed to talk to someone who could help him make sense of the storm inside him. Without thinking much about it, he grabbed his phone and scrolled through his contacts until he found the number he was looking for. Des, "You sound like you haven't slept in days." His brother Michael's voice came through the speaker with a mix of concern and familiarity. "I didn't sleep last night," Desmond admitted. It's been a rough few days." There was a long pause on the other end of the line before Michael responded. "You want to talk about it?" Desmond hesitated. He wasn't sure where to begin, or if he even wanted to. But something about hearing his brother's voice made him feel like maybe, just maybe, he didn't have to carry this weight alone. "Something happened with a neighbor of mine, Margaret. She called the cops on me." There was a sharp intake of breath from Michael. "What? Why?" "Because I was walking past her house. She thought I was, I don't know, some kind of threat. She didn't recognize me, I guess, and she panicked. It was the first thing that came to her mind." Desmond could feel the tension in his voice, the bitterness creeping in. "Jesus, Michael said softly. I can't say I'm surprised, but that doesn't make it any less infuriating." Desmond finished for him. "Yeah, and hurtful." Desmond nodded, even though Michael couldn't see him. "She came to apologize last night. Said she felt horrible about it. And I believe her, I really do. But I don't know if that makes a difference. I don't know if an apology can fix something like this." There was silence on the line, and then Michael spoke again, his voice low and steady. "It's not just about her, is it?" "No," Desmond admitted. "It's about everything. Every time something like this has happened, every time I've had to prove to people that I belong in spaces I've earned my way into. I thought I'd learn to deal with it, but this time, it feels different." She had been wrong. So terribly, unforgivably wrong. Tears welled in her eyes as she lay there, the realization settling over her like a heavy, suffocating blanket. Desmond had saved her, but she had nearly destroyed him, if not physically, then emotionally, spiritually. The man she had feared, the man she had called a threat, had shown her more humanity than she had shown him. And now, as she lay there in the quiet of the hospital room, Margaret knew that nothing would ever be the same. The weight of her assumptions, once invisible to her, was now impossible to ignore. Shadows in the light. Margaret Evans lay still in the hospital bed, her mind a tumult of thoughts she wasn't prepared to confront. The rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor was steady, grounding her in the present, but her mind kept wandering back to that singular moment. The moment she had seen him through her window, her instincts quick to misjudge, her fear coloring every second. Desmond Harris, the man she'd accused, the man who had saved her. It was a strange kind of revelation, one that came with a weight she couldn't shed. Margaret had spent her entire life in this neighborhood. It was a world she had built around herself, one where the manicured lawns and friendly waves created a facade of safety and understanding. But now it felt like the thin veil had been ripped away, revealing something darker beneath it. She closed her eyes, trying to stave off the tears that were pushing at the edges of her resolve. How could she have been so wrong? The door creaked open softly, and a nurse entered, breaking the silence of Margaret's thoughts. She was a young woman with kind eyes, her hair pulled back in a tight bun. Margaret forced a smile, though her heart wasn't in it. "How are we feeling today, Mrs. Evans?" the nurse asked, checking the machines beside the bed. Margaret hesitated. How was she feeling? Physically, her heart was on the mend. The doctors had told her she was lucky, that the quick actions of the man who performed CPR had saved her life. But emotionally, mentally, she wasn't sure if lucky was the word she'd use. "I'm fine," Margaret answered, her voice soft, but not quite convincing. The nurse glanced at her, sensing something beyond the typical post-hospital stay weariness. "Do you need to talk to someone?" the nurse asked gently, setting down her clipboard. It's not uncommon to feel a little off after something like this. Margaret shook her head, biting her lip. How could she even begin to explain what she was feeling? That the man she had feared, the man she had wrongly assumed to be dangerous, had been the one to pull her back from death. And now, She had to sit with the crushing realization that she had been a prisoner of her own prejudices. As the nurse left, Margaret found herself staring at the ceiling. She was alone again, but she didn't feel like the same person who had lived in that neighborhood for so many years. Desmond's face kept flashing through her mind, the calm determination in his eyes as he knelt over her, pressing down on her chest, breathing life back into her. She remembered his expression from earlier that morning when she had first seen him outside her window. He had been walking, carrying nothing but his own sense of purpose, and yet in that split second, her fear had ignited, fueled by decades of unspoken biases, nurtured by a lifetime of insular living in a neighborhood that prided itself on safety. Safety from whom? Margaret thought bitterly. From men like Desmond. The truth gnawed at her now, undeniable and uncomfortable. The real danger had never been him. It had been her assumptions, her willingness to see him not as a man, but as a threat. Desmond sat at his desk, a half-finished bottle of water beside his computer, as he tried to focus on the stack of patient files waiting for his review. His work as a cardiologist had always been his escape, a place where his expertise, not his appearance, defined him. But today, the weight of the past few hours lingered, dragging him back into a reality he had long tried to ignore. He knew the officer's apology had been sincere, and yet it had left him feeling hollow. It was just another reminder that no matter how far he climbed, no matter what he achieved, the world still saw him a certain way, still expected him to prove his humanity in ways no one else had to. He had moved to this new neighborhood for peace, for a sense of accomplishment, and yet peace had eluded him at every turn. First the assumptions, the stares, the accusations. Then Margaret. Her face haunted him, not because of the way she had judged him, but because of how familiar it all felt. There was a time when Desmond had believed that his achievements, becoming a doctor, buying a home in an affluent neighborhood, would insulate him from the biases of the world. But today, standing on that street, watching the officers question him as if his very presence was a crime, he realized that no amount of success could erase the prejudices woven into the fabric of society. The weight of his thoughts settled into his chest, heavy and unrelenting. He had saved Margaret's life, and yet he couldn't shake the feeling that the world saw him as a potential danger until proven otherwise. He rubbed his eyes, trying to focus on his work, but the images of the day kept intruding. A knock at the door startled him. Desmond turned, his heart skipping a beat, though he wasn't sure why. He wasn't expecting anyone. For a moment, the thought of another confrontation crossed his mind. What if it was more officers, or perhaps a neighbor with another baseless complaint? His chest tightened involuntarily. He hesitated for a second before walking to the door. When he opened it, he found himself staring into the tired, remorseful eyes of Margaret Evans. She looked frail, wrapped in a thick coat, even though the evening air was mild. Her hands trembled slightly as she held them together in front of her, clutching them like a lifeline. Desmond blinked, momentarily thrown off by her presence. "Dr. Harris." Her voice was thin, and for the first time, she sounded as small as she looked. Desmond stood silently, unsure of what to say. This was the last thing he had expected. I wanted to come by," Margaret continued, her voice shaking now. "I didn't know how to say this, but I needed to." Desmond stepped aside, silently inviting her in. Margaret entered hesitantly, her eyes flitting around the room as though it was foreign territory, both in its physical space and the emotions it now carried. She sat down on the edge of the couch, clutching her hands in her lap. "I owe you an apology," she began, her voice soft but firm. I misjudged you. I misjudged everything about you, and I've been sitting with that for days now, and it feels unbearable." Desmond stayed quiet, his expression neutral, though his mind was racing. He hadn't expected an apology, certainly not one that felt this raw. Margaret exhaled shakily, as if the weight of her own words was pushing down on her. "You saved my life, and all I did was treat you like a threat. I don't have an excuse for that. I can't explain it away, and I won't try to. But I needed to come here and tell you that I was wrong." Desmond leaned back against the wall, crossing his arms as he listened. He wanted to believe her words, wanted to feel the sincerity behind them, but he had heard apologies before. Apologies that faded into nothingness, words that meant little once the moment passed. "I'm not asking for your forgiveness," Margaret added quickly, her eyes downcast. "I'm not even sure I deserve it. But I couldn't go on without acknowledging what I did. You didn't deserve that. You didn't deserve any of it." The room was heavy with the unspoken emotions between them. Desmond felt a surge of conflicting feelings: anger, exhaustion, a strange sense of vindication, but also empathy. He could see the toll this was taking on her, how much it had shaken her world. "I appreciate that you came here," Desmond finally said, his voice measured. "And I accept your apology." Margaret looked up, a flicker of relief crossing her face, but Desmond wasn't finished. "But this isn't just about you and me," he continued. "It's about how the world sees people like me. How quick it is to make assumptions, to be afraid without reason. You were afraid of me before I even said a word to you. And that's the real problem. It's not just about what happened. It's about why it happened." Margaret nodded, tears brimming in her eyes. "I know," she whispered. "And I'm going to do better. I have to." For a long moment, they sat in silence. Desmond could feel the weight of her apology, but he also knew that change, real change, would take more than words. It would take time and effort, and a willingness to confront the uncomfortable truths that people like Margaret had long avoided. Margaret rose slowly, her frailty more pronounced than ever. "Thank you for hearing me," she said softly, wiping at her eyes. "I won't forget what you did for me, and I won't forget how wrong I was." As she left, closing the door behind her, Desmond stood alone in the quiet of his home. The apology had been real, and perhaps for the first time, so was the promise of change. But even so, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of a much longer journey for both of them. Desmond walked back to his desk, sitting down in front of his computer. The patient files were still waiting, but for the moment, they could wait a little longer. He stared at the blank document on his screen, the cursor blinking steadily. The words weren't coming, but that was okay. Today was. The weight of truth. Desmond sat at his desk long after Margaret had left, the silence of his home settling in like a heavy blanket. The blinking cursor on his computer screen seemed to mock him, a relentless reminder of the work that awaited him, the work that had once been his escape. But tonight, it was different. Tonight, it felt impossible to focus on the routine comforts of his job when the events of the past few days were unraveling him. He stared at the screen, but his mind was still with Margaret, replaying her words, her expression, her shaky apology. There was something undeniably genuine in her remorse, but Desmond couldn't shake the gnawing feeling in his chest. Was this just another chapter in a cycle he had seen too many times before? A moment of contrition, followed by a return to the status quo. He rubbed his temples, feeling the weight of it all. He'd experienced too many Margarets in his life, people who, whether through fear, ignorance, or sheer unwillingness to confront their own biases, had made him feel like a stranger in his own skin. Each time, it chipped away at him, just a little more. There was a part of him that wanted to move past this, to forgive and forget. But the deeper, more weary part of him knew it wasn't that simple. Margaret's apology didn't erase the larger, more systemic problem. It didn't undo the damage caused by the assumptions she had carried with her, assumptions so deeply ingrained that she hadn't even realized they were there until they nearly cost her everything. He stood up abruptly, the chair scraping the floor as he moved away from his desk. He needed air. He needed space to think, to breathe. His home, normally his sanctuary, felt too confining, too suffocating tonight. Grabbing his jacket, he headed for the door, unsure where he was going but knowing he couldn't stay here. The night was cool and quiet as Desmond walked down the empty streets of the neighborhood. The same neighborhood that had once felt like a badge of honor now felt like a trap. He had worked hard to get here, countless hours in medical school, sleepless nights during residency, pushing himself to be the best, to prove he deserved his place. And yet, despite all that, he couldn't shake the feeling that the world still saw him as an outsider. The streetlights cast long shadows on the pavement, and Desmond found himself walking aimlessly, letting his thoughts wander. The streets were eerily quiet, with only the occasional rustle of leaves or distant hum of a car in the distance. It was a kind of stillness that used to comfort him, but now it felt laden with the unspoken tension that had been simmering for days. As he turned a corner, Desmond's eyes were drawn to a house a few blocks down. Margaret's house. He hadn't intended to walk this way, but here he was, standing across the street from the place where everything had changed. The windows were dark, the house silent, but Desmond couldn't help but imagine the woman inside, grappling with the same uncomfortable truths that had haunted him his entire life. For a moment, he considered turning back. What good would it do to stand here, staring at a house in the middle of the night? But something held him in place, a need to confront the weight of what had happened, to truly reckon with it. He crossed the street slowly, his footsteps soft against the pavement. He stopped in front of the house, staring at the window where Margaret had first seen him, the window through which she had judged him. It was such a small, ordinary thing, a window, a glance, a moment, but it had been enough to change everything. Desmond could still feel the sting of that judgment, sharp and visceral, cutting through him like a knife. He stood there for a long time, his breath steady, his mind racing. Part of him wanted to walk away, to let this moment slip into the past, but another part of him knew he couldn't. This wasn't just about Margaret. It was about the countless other moments in his life where he had been reduced to a stereotype, a figure of suspicion rather than a person. It was about the weight he had carried for so long, the burden of being seen as other, even in spaces where he had worked so hard to belong. Desmond's hand clenched into a fist at his side. He had spent his entire life navigating a world that expected him to prove his worth, to disarm the fears and suspicions of others simply by existing. And it was exhausting. Tonight, it felt especially heavy. Inside her house, Margaret lay awake in her bed, staring at the ceiling. Sleep had eluded her ever since she'd left Desmond's home, her mind replaying their conversation, the weight of his words pressing down on her like a leaden blanket. It's about why it happened. Desmond's voice echoed in her head, a reminder that her apology, while necessary, was only the beginning. It wasn't just about her mistaken judgment. It was about the systems that had fed her fear, the biases she had absorbed over a lifetime without even realizing it. She had grown up in a world that told her to be afraid of the unknown, of the unfamiliar, of people who didn't look like her. And though she had never considered herself prejudiced, she had learned in the worst possible way that fear could masquerade as instinct, and instinct could lead to devastating consequences. Margaret closed her eyes, her chest tightening with shame. Desmond had saved her life, quite literally, and yet she had nearly taken something from him in return. His dignity, his humanity. She had allowed her fear to blind her to the man standing before her, and the guilt of that realization was almost unbearable. She sat up in bed, unable to stay still any longer. Her body ached from the recent heart attack, but the pain in her chest was more than physical. She needed to do more. Apologizing wasn't enough. She had to confront the truth of her actions, the truth of her fear. Rising slowly, Margaret wrapped herself in a blanket and walked to the window, the same window where she had first seen Desmond that fateful day. She stared out into the dark street, her breath fogging up the glass slightly. And then, her heart nearly stopped for the second time that week. There he was. Desmond stood in the street, his silhouette framed by the dim light of a street lamp. He wasn't moving, just standing there, staring at her house. Margaret's heart raced, but this time, it wasn't out of fear. She didn't know why he was there, or what he was thinking, but she felt a surge of something she hadn't expected. Empathy. She stood frozen at the window, watching him, unsure of what to do. Should she go outside? Should she speak to him? What could she possibly say that would make this right? The apology she had offered earlier had felt so small, so inadequate. How could words ever make up for the damage she had caused? Margaret's hand hovered over the door handle, but she hesitated. What if her presence only made things worse? What if she was intruding on a moment that wasn't hers to enter? As she debated with herself, Desmond slowly turned away from the house, his shoulders slumping slightly as if weighed down by the same burden Margaret now carried. He walked back down the street, his figure growing smaller and smaller until he disappeared into the night. Margaret sank into the nearest chair, her heart heavy with the knowledge that this wasn't over, not for her and not for Desmond. She had to do more, be more. But for now, all she could do was sit in the silence and confront the uncomfortable truths she had spent a lifetime avoiding. Outside, the street was quiet once again, but the weight of what had passed between them lingered, a shadow that neither of them could outrun. The long walk home. Desmond walked aimlessly, the cool night air biting at his skin. His feet moved of their own accord, tracing the familiar streets without purpose. The solitude of the night wrapped around him like a comforting shroud, but the thoughts in his mind remained anything but quiet. For a brief moment, standing outside Margaret's house, he'd felt the weight of their shared history, hers and his, but also something far larger, something societal, something systemic. But now, with every step he took away from her house, he was left alone with the ghosts of all the similar encounters he had experienced. The woman clutching her purse a little tighter as he passed her on a crowded subway platform. The security guard who followed him around the electronics store, eyes never leaving him, even as he pretended to browse. The well-meaning coworker who had complimented him on how articulate he was, as though they were surprised that he could speak without stumbling over his words. He had learned to smile through all of it, to deflect, to internalize, to become an expert in the delicate art of avoiding confrontation. He had mastered the act of playing along, making others feel comfortable even when they had no right to be. But it was exhausting, and Margaret's mistake had torn open a wound he thought he had healed long ago. There was a heaviness in his chest that no amount of walking seemed to shake off. Desmond opened his eyes, staring out at the darkening sky. The apology hung in the air, but it didn't bring the relief the officer probably hoped it would. "You didn't know who I was," Desmond said, his voice calm. "You assumed because of how I looked. That's the problem, officer. It's not just about this one time. It's about what happens every time." "I know," the officer said quickly, almost too quickly. "I know it's not right, and I'm not trying to make excuses. It's complicated. Complicated." That was the word Desmond had heard 1,000 times before. The word people used to avoid the deeper conversation, to sidestep the discomfort of confronting the truth. "Is it?" Desmond asked, his voice sharper now, though not unkind. "Is it really that complicated to see someone for who they are, instead of what you assume they might be?" There was silence on the other end, and for a moment, Desmond wondered if the officer would hang up. But then he spoke again, this time slower, as if carefully choosing his words. "You're right," the officer admitted. "It shouldn't be complicated. But for some of us, it's how we were trained to see the world. And it's hard to unlearn." Desmond felt a pang of frustration, but also a strange sense of understanding. He knew that the officer was being honest, even if his honesty was uncomfortable. Desmond himself had spent years unlearning things society had taught him about who he was supposed to be, where he was supposed to belong. It wasn't an excuse, but it was a reality. "Unlearning is a process," Desmond said after a long pause. "But it's a necessary one. Otherwise, nothing changes." The officer exhaled audibly. "Yeah, you're right about that. I don't know how to fix something this big." Desmond's lips tightened into a thin line. That was the real question, wasn't it? How to fix something so deeply ingrained, so pervasive that it touched every part of life. It wasn't just about a single incident, or even a series of incidents. It was about the fabric of society itself, the assumptions, the biases, the invisible weight that people like Desmond carried every day. I don't have all the answers either, Desmond admitted. But I do know that it starts with moments like this, with recognizing the problem, with accountability. There was another long pause, and then the officer spoke again, his voice quieter this time, almost humbled. I'll try to do better. I know that doesn't mean much right now, but I will. Desmond nodded, though the officer couldn't see him. That's all anyone can do, he said softly. Try. When the call ended, Desmond placed the phone back on the counter, his mind swirling with thoughts. He wanted to believe that the officer would change, that something in today's events would shift the way he saw the world. But Desmond also knew that change, real change, didn't happen overnight. It was a slow, painful process, one that required more than just good intentions. He sat down on the couch, his gaze drifting to the boxes once again. Inside those boxes were the pieces of his life, books, photos, memories of a journey that had brought him here. But now, they felt like relics of a story that didn't quite fit this place anymore. This neighborhood, with its perfect lawns and quiet streets, wasn't the refuge he had hoped it would be. It was just another battleground, another place where the invisible weight of assumptions would follow him. He sighed, running a hand over his face. The exhaustion from the day's events was finally catching up to him, and his body ached with the effort of both the physical and emotional strain. He had saved a life today, but he wasn't sure if he had made any real difference. Margaret would live, but would she see him any differently when she woke up? Would the officers remember this day, or would it fade into the background of their routine? Desmond leaned back, closing his eyes. He wasn't sure what the answers were, but he knew one thing for certain. The fight wasn't over. It never would be. Across town, in a quiet hospital room, Margaret Evans stirred. Her eyes fluttered open, and for a moment, she didn't know where she was. The beeping of machines filled the air, and the sterile scent of antiseptic stung her nose. Slowly, memories of the day began to surface. The panic, the pain, the sudden darkness. But then something else emerged from the haze. A face, calm and focused, hands pressing rhythmically on her chest, a voice urging her to breathe. Desmond. She remembered now. He had saved her. The man she had accused, the man she had judged, had saved her life. Margaret's chest tightened, but not from the lingering effects of her heart attack. It was something else, something deeper, more unsettling. For the first time, she felt the weight of her own assumptions pressing down on her, suffocating her in a way that no physical ailment ever could. I get it, Des, Michael said quietly. And you're right. An apology doesn't fix it. But maybe it's a start. Maybe it's a way to move forward. If not for her, then for you. Desmond leaned against the wall, letting his brother's words sink in. Was that what he needed? A way forward? He'd spent so long pushing down his feelings, smoothing things over, trying to be the bigger person, that he'd forgotten what it felt like to confront the hurt head-on. You don't have to forgive her, Michael continued. And you don't have to make this about her, either. But you do have to figure out what you need. What's going to help you heal? Yeah, Desmond whispered, his voice barely audible. I know. But the truth was, he didn't know. Not yet. Days passed, and Desmond went through the motions of life. Work, errands, small social interactions. But the weight of that night stayed with him, hovering in the background of his mind. He avoided Margaret, though their paths didn't cross much in the first place. He wondered if she was avoiding him too, if she was still grappling with her guilt, just as he was grappling with his anger. One afternoon, as Desmond sat in his office, staring blankly at a patient chart, he heard a soft knock on his door. Des. It was Olivia, one of his colleagues and close friends. Got a minute? Desmond gestured for her to come in, though he wasn't sure he had the energy for a conversation. Olivia sat down across from him, concern etched across her face. You've been distant. I mean, more than usual. He gave her a weak smile. Yeah, I guess I have. She tilted her head, her eyes searching his. You want to talk about it? Desmond sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose. I don't even know where to start. Olivia waited patiently, her silence encouraging him to continue. And so, for the first time in days, Desmond let the words spill out. He told her everything. Margaret, the apology, the sleepless nights, the long walks through the quiet streets. He didn't hold back, didn't sugarcoat anything. He laid it all out, the anger, the hurt, the confusion. When he was done, Olivia sat quietly for a moment, processing everything he had said. Finally, she spoke, her voice gentle but firm. You've been carrying this weight alone for too long, Death. It's okay to be angry. It's okay to not know what to do next. But you don't have to figure it all out on your own. Desmond looked at her, feeling the truth of her words sink in. You're right, he said softly. I don't. It wasn't an answer. It wasn't a solution. But it was a step. And for now, that was enough.